I would imagine most people have heard by now about the very sad news about Dr. Jason Arday. I'd like to unpack my thoughts a bit because unfortunately, and with all due respect, this situation is a lot bigger than just Dr. Arday himself, which is precisely why it caused such a furor in the first place. And it's not going to die down, unfortunately, just because of a personal tragedy. This was caused such outrage because it was a story about a society that's living by lies. And as it happens, about an individual who was living by lies as well. But the bigger story and the bigger outrage, I'm going to contend, was that it exposed a country, a society, a nation, and august institutions that were living by lies and have been for some time and are corrupt. And that's why it had such an outsized response. Okay, so I'm going to depersonalize this away from that one gentleman and unpack my thoughts about why this is so meaningful for our society. Now, to put this in perspective, I'm going to give you another example, and those of you who are British and over 45 will remember this. Jonathan Aitken was a Tory MP, a Conservative politician, cabinet minister, so he's front bench politician, the secretary to the Treasury under John Major. So he's best known for having a spectacular fall from grace in the 1990s involving failed libel action against The Guardian, who were doing an investigative piece of reporting on him with regard to corruption. And he was perjured, he perjured himself and went to prison. So in April 1995, I think it was, The Guardian made allegations about his links to certain Saudi interests and money changing hands and all this, that and the other. And he famously said as follows, he doubled down basically and said as follows: "If it falls to me to start a fight to cut out the cancer of bent and twisted journalism in our country with the simple sword of truth and the trusty shield of British fair play, so be it. I am ready for the fight." And he sued for libel. Well, the case collapsed. As I said, he perjured himself and he was sentenced to 18 months in prison, of which he served 7 in Belmarsh, which is not where you want to be in prison. It's a very rough prison, especially if you're a posh Conservative MP. And of course, the whole way along, he was ridiculed and lampooned dreadfully, precisely because of his hypocrisy and his ludicrous, bombastic quotes about the trusty sword of truth. That's followed him for the rest of his life. What did he do? He had a spiritual awakening. He had a religious conversion in prison, became an Anglican minister and worked for the remainder of his life pretty much with prisoners' charities and things like that, and became highly regarded. So it's just an example of how you can play things if you want to, when you are caught massively red-handed in the most abominable ways. When you're a proven hypocrite and liar, how you can still turn it around. And more than that, I think it's a great example, you see, because it's, as the Thais would say, same but different. He is a really good comparison in a way, because a mid-1990s posh white man probably still was probably did have a certain amount of white privilege then, to be fair. And I think a lot of people, increasing amount of people, including people in the black community, would attest to the fact that at least at the level of a Cambridge professor, Dr. Arday may have had some black privilege there, or something similar, or ethnic minority privilege, or something like that, which of course, as we've all commented on, was unfair, most of all to him. right? But there is a similarity there because both of these men are alleged to be privileged, right? But one's white and one's black. One was from back then, one is from right now. In both cases, they were living by lies, and the society at fault was promoting them in their living by lies, and the whole thing came crashing down. There was, however, a difference in the way that those two individuals approached that. So now I'm going to go directly to the source of the quote, living by lies, which of course is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Now, he's well known for writing the Gulag Archipelago, which is an epic of, I would say, not just Soviet history, but also it's a story of personal transformation. It's a 2,000-page book that describes what the Soviet Gulag prison system was like. But Alexander Solzhenitsyn was a political prisoner. He wasn't a common criminal. Like many soldiers, he was grabbed on, like many patriots, he was one of the first to go to prison. He was grabbed on his way back from war, as many of the soldiers, patriots, were, because the patriots were the most threatening of all to Stalin. So he had them all rounded up as they re-entered Russia from having won the war. And ostensibly it was over a letter in which he was critical to about Stalin that was intercepted. But this happened with, you know, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So he's in prison, licking his wounds and feeling very, very sorry for himself, as you would expect. Because at this juncture, as far as we know in the story, he hasn't actually done anything wrong. Now, this chapter that details this process best, as I always say, is the best piece of writing in all of non-fiction. It's chapter 1, part 4 of Gulag Archipelago. The chapter is called The Ascent. It's about a spiritual awakening when you realize that you've been living by lies. Up until this point, he's been writing the book from the perspective of a country that's living by lies, which the United Kingdom most certainly is. And which is why everybody has been so exercised by this issue, because we all know it to be true. It's the elephant in the room. So up until this point in the book, Solzhenitsyn has been writing similarly about Russia. And at this chapter, it becomes personal, because he's talking about what prison is for, that it gives you time to think. Now, of course, I'm not drawing a comparison and suggesting that Dr. Arday's misdemeanors should have sent him to prison, by the way. This is a spiritual comparison, not a literal comparison. And most of all, I'm talking about a society-wide problem, not an individual. So the ascent begins as follows. And the years go by, not in swift staccato as they joke in camp, winter, summer, but a long drawn-out autumn, an endless winter, an unwilling spring, and only a summer that is short. In the archipelago, summer is short. Even one mere year, woo, how long it lasts. Even in 1 year, how much time is left for you to think. And then he describes how miserable the Soviet prison system is, and he carries on. And that is only 1 year. And there are 10. There are 25. And then too, when you are lying in the hospital with dystrophy, that too is a good time to think. Think. Draw some conclusions from misfortune. So in the grimness of prison and manual labour, he's got nothing to do but think. And as he thinks, he realises that he's in the right place. As a political prisoner, he was butthurt and full of self-pity, and you can understand why. But reading between the lines from some chapters earlier in the book, I think we don't need too much imagination to work out the sorts of things that Russian soldiers might have been doing as they were marauding through Germany. Right, so the longer he's got to think, even if it's just the cruel way he treated his first wife, or the way he beat a prisoner too hard when he was an officer or something. He thinks and he thinks and he thinks, and this is an invitation to all of us on an individual basis to live not by lies. He comes to the conclusion that he's been living by lies. He thought he was a fine, upstanding citizen, and he wasn't. And now he's in prison, and that's the right place for him. Now, he then undergoes a radical spiritual transformation. And anybody who's been in drug addiction and got sober, been in prison and changed their ways and not gone back to prison, been caught out for being a hypocrite or a liar or a scumbag of some kind, and determined instead of doubling down to just bloody change their lives. Everybody who understands those processes will be deeply moved by this chapter that Solzhenitsyn writes, and I will do an entire video on that, I think, at a later date, because it's an incredible piece of literature, and it's from whence that famous quote about one small corner of evil is in everybody's heart and one small corner of good is in everybody's heart. So on an individual basis, let's be clear. When we're caught out, and we all have one small corner of evil in our heart, there's a fork in the road. Like, if we're going to be sort of binary about it, obviously there's every shade of action you could take in between, but there are two sort of binary choices. One is to double down and keep lying, and the other one is to liberate yourself, and in so doing, liberate an awful lot of people around you by telling the truth. Jonathan Aitken did that, and the rest of his life turned out to be far more meaningful than the sham that was apparently successful externally, but the sham of the first half of his life. So now let's look at how a society might do that. Well, similarly, it needs to undergo a reckoning. It needs to be purged of lies. And that's what this process has been. Because Cambridge is so, I would suggest, so perfect and so august and so quintessentially English, if you think about it as not even a metaphor, symbolically, it couldn't be more apex. Right? It symbolizes the apex of England, if you like. It's almost, in spiritual terms, more than the church would now, almost. And if you think this issue of the lies and the corruption and supporting individuals in their lies in order for you, the establishment, a politicized class of people, to continue with your agenda, if you think that is not of great import, then consider another a post that went out today. I'll put this in the description as well, that I thought was amazing, by Richard Dawkins, who I have a lot of, I wouldn't agree with him on issues of religion. I'm a not particularly devout Catholic, but I am definitely a cultural Christian, and I have a spiritual dimension to my life. So I would disagree with Richard Dawkins all over the place. But one thing I think I probably don't disagree with him on is that education should probably be secular. And so he issued a post today, or it might have been yesterday, about an Islamic, a Muslim academic who is fighting a sort of creationist agenda, really, at Cambridge, like a lot of Christian fundamentalists do, and how dangerous this is. The teaching of biology, correct biology, and correct evolutionary theory is being challenged greatly by this particular academic in Cambridge, and getting a lot of support from the system of Cambridge under the idea that properly taught ideas about evolution might harm Muslim students. And so if you think that the propping up of lies is just some kind of papery, flowery argument that doesn't have a lot of weight, that's just really to do with identity politics in Jason Arday's case and doesn't have serious ramifications, you'd be wrong. And all you need to do is read Dawkins on that subject. And as I said, Dawkins, you know, I disagree with him and all the other new atheists. They're very 2007 now. You know, they're not particularly in the zeitgeist right now, these guys, in terms of... So nobody's arguing that people shouldn't have religious beliefs. You know, I would argue that there's definitely a place for religious expression, and those guys, the new atheists, were wrong about that. And we're seeing that in a massive... becoming massively unfashionable, those new atheists, and Christianity in particular, and in particular sort of based and uncompromising versions of Christianity like Catholicism and Orthodoxy, becoming very popular again. So I'm not suggesting that we listen uncritically to Richard Dawkins, and I would have a lot to disagree with him about, but his posts about the corruption of Cambridge University, posted just today, are a fair-minded and balanced and critical reason why we cannot take our eye off the ball and give the likes of Cambridge University's elite administration a free pass, because there is great evil really being perpetrated in the name of identity politics and politicization of institutions in the academy, and, as I've previously posted, healthcare, and all sorts of inappropriate places where politics is being brought to bear on the subject where it has no good reason to be there, and has become a corrupting force. And so the Jason Arday case was about somebody being in a position they didn't deserve to be in, and talking a load of gobbledygook, and students being shortchanged and things like that, and other side issues that are still really important, like who would have got that job if he hadn't have, and so on and so forth. But there are equally weighty issues going on right now, such as correct science being attacked and sidelined by religious extremists, and the lying and weak leaders are aiding and abetting lies, in the same way that Solzhenitsyn was rounded up and hounded and imprisoned for a decade because of leaders who were living by lies. By the same token, august institutions in England, which hitherto has been seen as, or heretofore has been seen as, the bastion of freedom and rule of law and truth seeking, and what's more, an academic institution that's at the apex of that whole system, culture and civilization, has proven to be rotten pretty much to the core. And that's why we can't let it go, and it has to continue. And I think there's an appetite now to push this stuff down and collapse it. And we will massively benefit from that, because the truth is always best. And the truth will always out in the end. And so, in a sense, it's going to happen anyway one day. And so why allow the rot to continue? So that's my unpacking of the situation. It's incredibly unfortunate. There are individual, personal ramifications to this story that we should all reflect on. In recovery from addiction, we do this as standard in steps 4 and 5 and steps 8 and 9. We make an inventory of resentment, fear and harms we've done to others. And in steps 8 and 9, we make amends for those, oftentimes direct amends, which might include standing up or going to the local newspaper and saying, I'm a fraud. People have done this in recovery. I know guys that have served prison sentences on their amends, because they knew eventually they'd be caught anyway, and they can't any longer live by lies. I think society could do with having a look at things like the 12 steps that addicts work, and going back to basic principles of our cultural Christianity, our ethics of how we behave, and the importance of truth, the emphasis is placed on truth in the Christian intellectual tradition and the Western intellectual tradition. It is I'm not going to say uniquely Christian facet, obviously, but it is emphasized in Christianity. Logos, the truth, the word. It behooves us at this point, I think, precisely because of this tragedy, to get to the nub of what it's really all about, and not to cry off and be afraid of it because it's had such a ghastly ending. It actually warrants that we push on and finish the job.